The objective of this lesson is to read and write fractions with denominators of 10 and 100 in decimal form. In previous lessons, students worked on reading and writing fractions with denominators of tenths and hundredths. Students placed the fractions on a place value chart in their correct decimal place value. Today, students will focus on reading decimals using correct terminology and writing decimals with correct placement. When writing numbers, the only time a decimal point is needed is when the ones place needs to be identified, or when a number includes a value less than 1. The decimal point comes just after the ones place and before the tenths place. Let's use this dollar bill as the whole. A dime would represent 1/10 of the dollar bill, and a penny would represent 1/100th of the dollar bill. The value of the dime can be written in fractional form as 1/10, and the penny can be written in fractional form as 1/100th. Another way to write fractions with denominators of 10 and 100 are with decimals. On a place value chart, the value of 1 dime or 1/10 is recorded as a 1 in the tenths place. The tenths place is one place to the right of the ones and the decimal point. This can be written as 0.1 or decimal 1 and has a value of 1/10. The 0 is not necessary to write, but it can help to distinguish the decimal point more clearly. When there is one digit after the decimal point, that number represents tenths. 1/10 would be modeled with 1 rod. Let's model and read a couple more decimals. The first decimal, 0.5, reads as 5/10 and written as 5/10 and would be modeled with 5 rods in the tenths column. The next decimal, decimal 8, reads as 8/10 and can be written as 8/10 and would be modeled by placing 8 rods in the tenths column. Now let's move on to the penny. The value of 1 penny is 1/100th and is recorded as a 1 in the hundredths place. It is written as 0.01 or decimal 01. The hundredths place is 2 place value spots after the decimal, and the 0 is a placeholder. This value is read as 1/100th. When there are 2 digits after the decimal point, that number represents hundredths. This would be modeled by using a base 10 unit square and placing 1 in the hundredths column. Let's model, read, and write another decimal to the hundredths. 0.07. This decimal reads as 7/100ths and can be written as 7/100ths and would be modeled with 7 cubes in the hundredths column. Let's look at one last decimal, 0.23. This can be read as 23/100ths because the last digit in the number ends in the hundredths place. This decimal can be modeled as 23/100ths cubes or can be regrouped into 2 tenths rods and 3 hundredths cubes. Just as the whole number 23 is understood to be 2 tens and 3 ones, the decimal 0.23 is understood to be 2 tenths and 3 hundredths. As a fraction, it can be thought of as 23 hundredths, or 20 hundredths plus 3 hundredths. The 20 hundredths can also be thought of as 2 tenths, so a third way to think of it as a fraction would be 2 tenths plus 3 hundredths. The objective for this lesson was to read and write fractions with denominators of 10 and 100 in decimal form. We met this objective by modeling decimals to the hundredths with place value blocks and a place value chart. We read and wrote decimals to the hundredths and wrote the decimals equivalent fractions.